Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back again to As I Live and Grieve. Another special guest. I'm challenged with doing this every week for our listeners to find a guest who's interesting, who's really got something to say that's going to be of benefit. And this week is no exception. With me today is Litsa Williams. Hi, Litsa. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Before we actually get started on my questions, of which I have a few, would you just tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I think, as with a lot of people who are in the space of talking about grief, I always say there's a little bit of my story that's personal and then some that is professional. So on the professional side of things, I'm a clinical social worker and I'm the co-founder of What's Your Grief, which is unexpectedly at this point grown to be one of the largest US-based, at least, grief support websites online.
Yes.
I co-founded it with my business partner, Eleanor Haley, who's a counseling psychologist. And we actually met when we were working at a grief support organization. We were working with people who had experienced traumatic and unexpected losses in Baltimore. And really what connected us a lot there was that we had experienced personal losses ourselves. And we were really struggling in our work there to always find the online resources that we wanted to be able to give to our clients. And I mean, this was like we started What's Your Grief in 2012, but this was probably in like 2008, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were just kind of sitting around complaining a lot, but really connected that in our own personal grief. I lost my dad when I was a teenager. And then not too long after that, my sister, who was only 12 when my dad died, developed a really severe heroin addiction. And then we later lost her boyfriend, who was like a member of our family, lived with our family, to an overdose when I was in my mid-20s. And neither Eleanor nor I had really gone the traditional grief support routes. Like counseling and support groups never ended up being the things that really worked for us, even though now I've gone on to become a counselor and a person who runs support groups. So we really were always talking about the other things that we used, creative outlets, learning about grief, things like that. And we ultimately, kind of came together to found What's Your Grief based on that personal and professional background.
Right. Thanks for that. And I ran across What's Your Grief, of course, when I was looking for myself for some support. Didn't quite know. I'd been through grief before, but I mean, probably my very first experience in grief was in the 70s. And all right, listeners, now you have a little bit more insight into how long I've been grieving. But, and I say that because it's very true that grief can last for the rest of your life. And my first experience was I lost my father. I was right in the cusp of my 20s and about to be married when my father died. And so he was not able to give me away for my wedding, which is a huge milestone in a young girl's life. And then after that, my next loss was an infant less than 23 hours after birth. I lost a son. Then later it would be my mother, and most recently my husband. So I at one point ran across your website and found it to be just chock full of information, of supportive articles, of tips and hints, and watch out for this, and some take care of yourselves, and just a very diverse group of information, such that when my daughter and I decided to start this podcast, I went back to your website and visited it again to get an idea on some of the topics I might like to have guests cover. And now, lo and behold, here you are, you representing yourself and Eleanor both, and I appreciate it so much. But it's very true. Your website is probably the most comprehensive resource on grief that I have found on the internet. And I think that even goes internationally. And we have an international audience. So after this podcast releases, it may grow even bigger. We'll hope for that. We have listeners in 78 countries. So
Oh, that's amazing. And I mean, I appreciate hearing that so much. We say a lot that it's sometimes hard when you're behind a computer screen all the time. And I'm sure you feel this to some degree with doing a podcast as well. You put something out into the world and you hope this is reaching people. And you see numbers as behind the data analytics and things like that. But we just always really like when we get to talk to people who say, no, I found this and it was useful and I applied it.
Right. And then I'll go on and I'll say that as if your website wasn't enough, now you have published a book. And it's not just your ordinary book on grief that might be a memoir or personal accounting. This is actually a book of lists. It's a list of lists, if you will. There are lists for every aspect of grief that can help you, and even a list on how to create your own list, which can be so helpful when you're grieving. Now, this book just came out recently. What inspired the two of you to bring this book to publication?
That's a great question. I will say quite honestly, never really set out to write a book. We often think of What's Your Grief as something that we founded as filling the gaps that we saw in the online space. And so that is what we always set out to do. And we thought, oh, well, there's so many grief books that already exist. Do we really need to add to that library or write a book? And publishers had reached out because we'd written so much, and we'd always felt like it wasn't quite the right fit. And then not too long ago, a publisher reached out who was really like, I love the idea of you kind of taking what you've created in your website in terms of these like bite-size, interactive, like that types of or engaging types of ways for people to be able to learn about grief, but do it in a manageable way. Would you want to do that? And we thought, well, there are some gaps in the book, in the literature that we've seen. We do know that on our website, many people come and they say, I had all these grief books, but I hadn't been able to read more than a page because I was just too overwhelmed to read. But when I found your website, it was like, oh, I could just read an article. And so we thought if we could capture that in a book, that would be great. And so that's really what led us to saying, we'll give it a go and see how it goes.
And kudos to you and Eleanor for doing this. So I have the list of lists that is actually in your book, and it's where you kind of index everything. And it starts out with 5 little known truths about grief, 4 ways new losses bring up old ones, 5 building blocks of well-being, 56-word stories about grief that I found fascinating as a writer myself because words are everything to me. So there's just all kinds of neat things that are just inspirational to read, educational to read, and supportive to read as well. So, Christmas is certainly right around the corner when we're recording this, but at any time of year, this would make an excellent gift for someone because, as you say, when we're first in the initial phases of our grief, we just can't read more than a paragraph. I tried because I'm such a voracious reader. I tried, but I found myself having to reread the same sentences over and over again because I just wasn't absorbing them. It wasn't the right time for me. But with the lists, you can take it step by step. And it's also an excellent book if you are supporting someone who's grieving because it gives you some ideas that might help you either quietly support them or support them in conversation. I read in this list in this book that you might be feeling this. Is that so? So it's just so helpful, and it's a must as far as I'm concerned. I have a number of books on grief, but I consider this an essential one. And I have actually thought about gifting this to a couple of hospice homes in the area that may very well find it helpful for families as they're, awaiting that time or newly arrived at that point in life.
Oh, I appreciate that so much, the feedback. We do hope that ability to jump around in the book to find what's, we said that was the
Oh,
other thing that we were like, and this is a little bit grief and probably a little bit the fact that I personally have ADHD. And so
ah,
I'm also a
yep,
voracious reader, but when it comes to when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm stressed, have been grieving,
right,
I love when I can just kind of dip into something, get a little bit, feel like it was meaningful, and dip back out again. And so,
exactly,
yeah, that was so important for us. And, the other thing about saying that with hospices, I think the other thing we really wanted the book to capture was that, we're grieving many losses, both before people have died, but also
absolutely,
many non-death losses. I have
absolutely.
been very Eleanor's brother had a really severe traumatic brain injury. My sister,
Hmm.
as I mentioned, had a really severe addiction. And both of us from a young age, when those things happened, were so aware that we can be grieving people who are still alive
Absolutely,
for so many
absolutely,
reasons. And so we also wanted a book that would speak to that experience and not be so exclusively focused on bereavement grief that it would
right,
leave others grieving feeling like the book wasn't for them. So yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, even going through a divorce is a huge
absolutely.
loss. Losing a job, and who knows, with everything the entire world went through with COVID, I cannot believe for a second that there's not that everyone on this planet is grieving in one form or another because everyone lost so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just, I think our sense of safety and security, I mean, so many things that were
Yes.
destabilized that are really, I think people are dealing with so many different losses.
Yes, and there were comments, have been comments in the news about our children that the rates of depression and anxiety are higher than ever. And I have to believe, that a lot of that is just the impact of grief on their lives from their loss of a normal routine and their loss of going to school and socializing with friends and everything, and then having to be so isolated.
Oh, I
So,
think you're absolutely right. I said to a friend recently that I feel like oftentimes older generations, like, look to younger generations and think like, oh, we had to walk uphill both ways to school and, stuff was so much harder when we were kids. And, I have this experience where I look at kids now and I think this has been so hard. Like what they have
mhm,
had to live with and adjust to through COVID, through adjusting to online learning, and then just through, living through the world of social media and being
exactly.
exposed to so much that is happening in the news. I mean, it is a tough, tough
Yeah.
world for kids.
Yeah, and then so many choices, even with occupation. I mean, when I was graduating from high school, I could choose to be a nurse, a teacher, a secretary, or a mother, I think. Those are my choices. And now it's limitless. So
Yeah.
looking back, I might have been a forensic psychologist. Who knows what I might have been? My best friends think I probably should have been an attorney because there are times I like to argue. But anyway, only when I know I'm right. Okay, continuing on. On your website, of course, which goes into far more depth than your book does, there are many, many sections of your website that can be helpful to different people. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. We always struggle like sectioning up our website because
Exactly.
there is a lot that is happening there. So, but to give some broad brushstrokes, I think for people who really like to read and to learn, we have a huge blog, which, when I say blog, really just our library of articles. And at this point, there
Hmm.
are nearly 700 articles on all different topics of all things grief. And some of them, we always tell people, if you don't see a category that speaks to you, just use the search bar for like
Right.
whatever you're feeling. Like if you're like, I'm feeling guilt, like just type guilt in, if
Hmm.
I can't sleep, like, type that in because there are so many, but we do have to try to divide them up just into some areas that help you. Again, we're recording around the holidays. So holidays and special days, coping with those sorts of things, learning about grief. If you're somebody who really likes to understand grief theory, we try to divide things up in there so you can find all of those things. But then for people who are interested maybe more in some of the creative outlets and other ways to think about grief. We're big believers that just creative expression and the things that we do are so important in our grief. And so we have a section that is says share your grief, where we have just different types of kind of engaging things that you don't have to share it with us after you do it, but that are maybe to inspire ideas of things that you can do. Using photography as a tool for exploring grief has been hugely helpful for both Eleanor and I. That was one of the things that we connected about all those years ago. And it was one of those things where I think we both thought we were weird that we were using photography for grief. And then we were like, oh, wait, you too? Maybe there's something here. And there was so much, where for people who like to write or like to journal, but there wasn't as much that we could find for people who maybe wanted to use those other outlets. So we have that. We have a recipe story area. We have just
love that section. Love that.
And we're trying to grow that more. We have a friend who runs an Instagram called Grief Hungry, and she's working with us to even, we have so many submissions we're backlogged on to get more of them up on the site, because, I think food is just so connected to our memories and comfort and our history, and the foods that our loved ones loved and the foods that our, parents made us when we were little, and all of those things. And so for people who love to cook, to share their recipes and share the connection. And I think that in our grief, being able to teach people the foods that people taught us to make and to pass that on means so much. So,
well, it crosses generations. It really does.
Exactly. It really does. And there's so much just, I think, history in food. And it's something I was thinking recently, I don't know if you've seen it. There's, and now I'm blanking on the name, that Tembi Locke's book that they just made into a
From
Netflix.
Scratch.
From scratch, yes.
Yep. I read
it. We had read, some of her work on her blog when she had first started The Kitchen Widow. And I just think that book and the show captures so well how food becomes woven in, and then we carry it forward as a legacy.
It does. Yeah.
So we really love to kind of inspire people to say, wait, all this stuff you're doing with cooking, that can be part of your grief. And then we have 6-word stories, like you mentioned in the book. We have
love
that section on the website as well. And we have received thousands and thousands over the years. And I think one thing about 6-word stories is, even for all those people who say, oh, I'm not a writer, right? It takes away this barrier, because there's lots of people who say, oh, I'm not good at writing, or I get overwhelmed, or I don't know where to start. And I think there's something about saying just 6 words.
Only 6 words.
And, and I think it's really powerful that the 6-word story origin, is this may or may not be true story about Ernest Hemingway and his some author friends all sitting around making a bet that Hemingway couldn't write a short story in 6 words. And I really think the first 6-word story, it was a grief story. It was the 6-word story he wrote was baby shoes for sale, never worn. And I think, it's just like, it gets you in the gut. And, you go through the 6-word stories on the site, and every time I go through, it's just, it's unbelievable what 6 words can convey. So we love to give people a place to share that. And then we also have a grief secrets section where people can share their secrets. We post them anonymously on Instagram. We have postcards, or people can just send them to us, on Instagram anonymously. But so many people carry so many secrets, things that they're ashamed of or embarrassed about. And so often there are things that other people are experiencing too, and they just haven't spoken them out loud. And we think there's something valuable of just being able to get it out there, even if it's anonymously, even if you never share it with anyone in your life. We were very inspired by Post Secret, and that's on, on Instagram. You can see the grief secrets as well at Grief Secret.
Yeah, it's a way to kind of share the burden, to take some of the burden off your own shoulders without divulging, or without harming anyone. So, that's also a great opportunity. I love all of the different creative aspects you have to your website, because it does afford people an opportunity to contribute, but also to just kind of skim through the photos, for example.
Yeah.
And in that, you start thinking, I think, of your own memories and your own thoughts. So it's a form of self-care. I have to believe that, because it helps you kind of stimulate your brain
Yes.
and get different thoughts coming through your mind as well. Your entire website fascinates me. Job well done. Now, both you and Eleanor are professional therapists, clinicians,
Hmm.
whatever word you want to attach to it. Is there a place on your website that people can contact either of you for services?
Oh, that's a great question. So we actually don't currently, I say don't currently, I keep an itty bitty caseload, but it is very, very, it is very, very small. And generally we don't see individual folks anymore. What we do though is we actually have a closed community. That you can join, which is not therapy. It's not, and it's not traditional support groups either. Again, going back to the fact that that was never really our thing.
Right.
It's a private space though, where we have weekly webinars. We do groups where we do actually creative writing groups where we get together online. We give journal prompts, and then we all write together for 30 minutes, and then we talk about, on grief related topics. We do a getting things done session every Sunday, where it's just, in grief, it's so hard to just motivate yourself sometimes to do the dishes or do the laundry. And we just get on Zoom and spend 2 hours telling each other, spend the first 10 minutes saying, what have we struggled to get done this week that we're going to get done in these next 2 hours?
Right.
And then we, just spend time on Zoom getting that done. So it's a kind of and then there's a forum where you can kind of connect with other people. So that is something that is available. I will say, as I'm sharing this, it's actually not on the front end of our website. We usually just share it with people who are in our newsletter, because we know they're already kind of connected to us. So we send it out in our emails. But if any of your listeners are interested at all, they can certainly email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. Or if you sign up for our newsletter list, you'll get information about it that way. We don't put it on the front of the website just because we do like to keep it to a smaller size. And so we don't, we want it to be people who have already been connected and know who we are, not just like, oh, I just found you today and I'm signing up for it.
Well, and before we actually started, Litsa, I promised you no trick questions. That was kind of a trick question, because I want to applaud you for not making your website, here's the information about grief, and oh, by the way, here's what you can do for us. It's not that at all. It's a very selfless, supportive, inspirational website. And I wanted to get that out there in the open, that the purpose of your website is not for financial gain.
No.
It's not. It is truly a selfless endeavor for you and Eleanor to help people who are grieving. So on behalf of everyone everywhere that will always be grieving, thank you for doing that, because I think that's critical, to have that level of sincerity.
Well, thank you. And we just believe in it so strongly. I think that access is so important. And I think that, putting things out there that are just free and available to people, and knowing that so many people, whether it's because they don't have the interest in traditional grief, or they just don't have the means, they don't have the funds to be able to buy a book or go to therapy. We want people to be able to find things online that they can access for free, that is good quality stuff.
Well, and I think sometimes, for some of the websites, that they'll present a service, and that's totally fine. I get that. That's totally fine. But there's something about, for me personally, if I'm on a website and it's blatantly in my face, it's going to prevent me from absorbing what I really came to that website for. And that's knowledge, awareness, support, inspiration.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Good. Well, again, thank you for that. One more question. And then we'll probably have to wind it down. Now, do you also do a podcast?
Yes, sort of. is So we do not do a lovely, consistent, well-produced podcast as you and your daughter do. We have, we were early adopters relatively of podcasts, not super early adopters, but we started our podcast, I think, in late 2013 or early 2014. Okay. I always say it was before the podcast Serial, which then caused so many people to discover podcasts.
Yeah.
And we have done it on and off, but it is very informal. And I feel a little bit of guilt about ever promoting our podcast, largely because I know as a podcast listener, I love the predictability of podcasts. I find great comfort in knowing, oh, okay, this is going to come out every week. And I can know, oh, they're going to take a break. Oh, okay, it'll be for this long. And then there's going to be another season. Yeah. We are terrible at that. We literally just started recording again a few months ago after like a year and a half of not recording.
Okay.
But we do love doing it. It's not a guest format. It's really just like me and Eleanor getting together and chatting about grief, a different topic or different thing. Sometimes it's just like related to stuff that we've been thinking about personally that's been affecting our own loss. Sometimes it's, a random topic. So yeah, that's our sort of podcast.
And that's perfectly okay. But I mean, I did run across your podcast at one point, and the conversations are great. Stephanie and I, of course, opted to do the guest format because we're not professionals. We're not clinically trained. So we wanted to make sure that, other than speaking of our personal experiences and how we felt, primarily me, other than that, I want to make sure that if someone is addressing a topic on grief, that they have the background. They either have the personal experience, the personal story, or they have the training, the clinical training, the education. And that's why we start out the podcast as well, with just giving a little of your background as well, so people will know. But I absolutely love doing the podcast. I have found it very cathartic. I have healed, I have grown in my own grief with this podcast. And we've been at it now for, I think we just passed 2 years. Yeah, 2 years, because we've got over 100 episodes. And I still have a long list of people that I would like to have as guests. And then I run across other ones all the time. But it was certainly high time to represent what's your grief.
Well, I'm so grateful that you have added us to the list of people who's been able to join in on voices here. Because I do think that the other wonderful benefit of interviews is it keeps it interesting to have different people. I say at some point people must get really tired of just hearing my and Eleanor's voice all the time. We need to get some guests.
Probably not. But it's true. And, every person is different in their grief. Their grief, for me, for the experiences I've had with grief, each experience has also been different because I've been at a different age with different education, different awareness. Society and culture have been different around me.
Yes.
So they all have been different. So people need different things at different points in their lives. So that diversity is important. Now, the one list I did not notice in your book was a list of podcasts. So when you publish the second book or a blog about podcasts, I would like us to be represented on that list.
Absolutely. Guarantee that will happen. And, we have been talking, it's funny that you mentioned that. We had just been talking about how we should do a list of podcasts. So maybe this will be a good motivation for me to actually get that on the list for the blog.
There you go. Or even social media aspects of it, or social media resources, at any rate. Well, our time is winding down, sadly, Litsa. So before I wrap up and sign off, I do want to turn the mic over to you and let you speak directly to our listeners without me asking questions and directing the conversation, and let them know what you offer, if there's anything special coming up or any special interests or projects you might have that you'd like to put emphasis on. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I think we've covered a lot of the things that we offer that are on our website. And the only thing I would invite anybody to just come and check out the site. And one of the things we love about it is that it is no pressure. It's whatsyourgrief.com. You can just pop in there, and all the things we talked about with like share your grief, like you don't have to share anything. You can just come, you can read, you can peruse.
Right.
We do also, for people who like things that are really digging in a little bit more deeply, we have a number of online courses too that you can take. There's a bunch that are free that are creative expression. We have one on scrapbooking and art journaling you can take. We have one that's on just like a little mini coping with grief from home creative expression challenge, just like 10 little things that you can do on your own at home. So if you're kind of like, I'm not sure about this like creative outlet for grief, but I'd maybe want to check it out and try a couple of things, those are some just easy free things that you can access through the site. And otherwise, you can find us on social media at all the usual social media spots at What's Your Grief. And on our Instagram page, I will say again, for people who might not be sure about the photography stuff, but a little interested, about twice a year, and one will be coming up probably shortly after the holidays, we do photo challenges on Instagram where we get our community we post a photo prompt every day and people share on a hashtag. And it's a really great way to connect with other people who are grieving, who are using photography as a tool for grief.
That sounds fascinating. I'll have to check that one out myself. And I don't go on Instagram a lot, but I'm going to head there for this one. Well, thank you again and again. This is long overdue, truly, but you have such a great resource in your website that I just couldn't resist sharing it with everyone and directing their attention to your website for education, awareness, support, and inspiration. You've got all of those things to offer. Again, to you and Eleanor also, thank you so much for not having that hard sell out there, for making it truly a safe space, so to speak, for grievers to go without any pressure, to just be able to kind of poke around and see what's there that might help them. Now, unfortunately, and it always happens every week, it's my saddest part of the entire week when I have to sign off, invite everyone to come back again next week for another guest that's going to be truly fascinating. And we will all talk soon. Take care of yourselves as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.